Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Beginner's Guide for Automotive Photography. You are now watching Section 3, Understanding Your Gear. Now, whether you've already purchased a camera setup or you're searching online for your first one, it is incredibly important to know how to understand either what you already have or what's available to you on the market. So in this section, I'm going to be breaking gear down into 3 separate categories: cameras, lenses, and accessories. Now, you don't need to get a bunch of expensive gear right off the bat. In fact, a camera with one lens is probably all you need to get started. But the nice thing about cameras is if you stay with the same camera manufacturer, you can add to your collection slowly over time, which allows you to add more and more products and services to your clients. That being said though, it's very important to repeat something that I said in the first section, which is expensive gear does not make you a good photographer. The best way to explain this is simply this: expensive gear covers up a lot of mistakes that you are going to make as a beginner. Will your end result photos come out better on more expensive equipment? Of course they will. But if you're starting off as a beginner with a piece of equipment that's gonna cover up all the things you're doing wrong, you're never gonna learn how to improve those specific mistakes. Therefore, if you ever get stuck in a situation where maybe you have to use a lesser camera, chances are you're not gonna have any idea what you're actually doing. So with that being said, if you're rolling around with a cheaper camera setup, do not feel bad one bit. You are perfectly equipped to learn everything that you need to know. And quite honestly, most modern cameras are capable of producing absolutely stunning images in ideal conditions, so you really shouldn't have much to worry about. All right, with that being said, let's jump into the first category of gear, which is cameras. Now, like I mentioned in terms and definitions, there are really 4 variations of cameras that you are going to hear most often. The first 2 are being DSLR versus mirrorless cameras, and the other 2 being full frame cameras versus crop sensor cameras. Now, I already explained the differences between these 4 in the terms and definitions guide, but the point that I would like to carry forth over to you is that honestly, for a beginner, none of these things really matter. The most important thing you could be looking for in a camera that you're searching for as a beginner is its accessibility. Can you buy it easily? Is it easy to afford? And are the menus simple enough for you to understand? If you can use the menus, buy the camera, and you know where to get it, there really isn't much that you need to be concerned with. Now, don't get me wrong, there are benefits and drawbacks to each of these specific types of cameras. Mirrorless cameras, for example, typically will have a lower battery life than a DSLR camera since it requires the powering of the digital monitor inside the viewfinder as opposed to just reflecting the image back to you through a piece of glass. On the contrary though, some people prefer mirrorless cameras because they give you the ability to do something that's called silent shooting, which is taking photos without the camera making any shutter noise whatsoever. So, like I said, we can get caught up on paper specs and what certain cameras offer and what other cameras don't offer, but ultimately, as long as you can figure out how to get the thing in manual mode and put a lens on it, you're good to go. Speaking of lenses, let's talk about lens options. Like I mentioned in section 2 with terms and definitions, there are really 2 types of lenses that you are going to see most frequently, and those are prime lenses and zoom lenses. A quick recap for you in case you missed the second section. A prime lens is a lens that has a fixed focal length. So this, for example, is a 14mm lens. I cannot zoom to 20mm. I cannot zoom out to 11mm. It is locked in at 14mm. Whereas this lens on my camera is a 24 to 70mm, meaning I can zoom anywhere between 24mm all the way up to 70mm, depending on what the situation calls for. If you're a beginner and you're on a budget, I would highly recommend a prime lens to get started. Reason being is that prime lenses often offer wider aperture ranges for less money. So you can get yourself a prime lens, like a 50mm for example, that can shoot as wide as f1.8 for somewhere between $150 to $300. But if you want a 24 to 70mm lens that goes only to f2.8 for example, like the lens I showed you earlier, you're going to have to spend nearly as much as you spent on your camera just to get that piece of glass. Don't get me wrong, the versatility of having a zoom lens with a wide aperture is absolutely awesome, but But if you don't have the budget for it, you can grab yourself a couple of prime lenses for less than the price of one zoom lens and have all that variability ready to go. Something I would like to mention about zoom lenses though, before we get too far ahead, is that some zoom lenses have variable aperture ratings. Now this lens does not have variable aperture, but let's for sake of the argument say that it does. What variable aperture means is that I may be able to shoot at f2.8 at 24 millimeters, but if I zoom into 70 millimeters, I might only be able to step down to f5.6. So if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you're messing with a zoom lens and you can't figure out why your aperture keeps changing on you, you're welcome. Another important thing to mention about lenses is something called lens mounts. Now each camera has its own specific type of lens mount that you will need to make sure that the lens you're buying also shares in order for it to connect properly. So again, using my Sony as an example, this Sony a7 Mark III is referred to as an E-mount camera. This means that when I shop for lenses online, I need to specify that I am looking for a Sony E-mount lens, otherwise it may not fit properly onto the camera. Each manufacturer can have multiple types of lens mounts, so just because you found a Canon lens doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit your Canon camera. You need to make sure that the mounts are the same. So let's say you are shopping for lenses and you see this complicated equation on your screen. What does it mean? How do you understand it? Let's break this down one by one. Right off the bat, you've got the brand. In this case, this says Rokinon. This is the manufacturer of the camera lens. Next, you have 14mm. This stands for 14 millimeters. This is the focal length of the lens that you're looking at. If it was a zoom lens, this is where you would see 14 to 24, for example. Next, you will see f2.8. This is the widest aperture value that this particular lens is capable of reaching. Again, if you're looking at a zoom lens that has variable aperture, you may see something like f2.8 to f5.6 in this same section. Next, you see Series 2 lens for Sony E. This is simply designating that this lens is made for the Sony E-mount ecosystem. The awesome things about lenses is that there really is no right or wrong answer here. Whatever focal length that you prefer to use is exactly that. It's what you prefer to use. Shown up on screen here are 3 photos taken roughly in the same location of the same subject, just with varying focal lengths. You can see here how drastically the characteristics of your image change depending on the focal length that you choose to use. So browse around a few car photography galleries, see what types of photos you like best to determine which next lens is the best choice for you. Me personally, I started off being a huge fan of really wide angle lenses, but I've kind of slowly transitioned to be more of a heavy zoom person. Something that you will notice with more zoomed in focal length lenses is that you will get more natural background blur with these lenses that have a really intense zoom. So if you've got a lens that can zoom in really far and has a wide aperture, you can get absolutely crazy background blur, which is something that I am a massive fan of. But again, everybody's got their own preferences, so choose your lenses based on your own preferences. All right, next let's talk accessories. And this next one I did mention in the opening section, but I want to touch on it again and explain it a little more in detail. I am of course talking about a circular polarizer filter, also known as a CPL filter. Now this is about the only camera accessory that I could think of that is an absolute necessity for automotive photographers. In order for me to explain to you the importance of CPL filters, take a look at these 2 photos on screen. Both photos were taken with the exact same composition, but one was taken with a CPL filter applied to the lens, and the other photo was taken with no CPL filter applied. Notice how drastic the reflections are on the photo that doesn't have a filter on it. These circular polarizing filters have polarizers in them similar to sunglasses, which helps cut down on a lot of those nasty reflections. Not only do these CPL filters cut down on reflections, but it really allows you to capture the true vibrant nature of a lot of these metallic paints that come on cars these days. Simply put, you cannot capture the full dynamic range and vividness of some of these beautiful paint jobs on cars without having a circular polarizing filter. Like I mentioned in the previous sections, these can range from being anywhere from $15 to even upwards of $250 to $300. You don't need anything crazy to get started, but do keep in mind, you are putting a piece of glass in front of your lens, which is another piece of glass. So if you buy an expensive lens, I would recommend putting an expensive CPL on it to not diminish the quality of your nice lens. The next accessory I'm going to recommend is an external hard drive. I have gone through about 12 of these this year. I usually buy 2 terabyte portable hard drives, and that's what I load all my raw files on. You will notice very quickly in your career as a photographer that you are going to use up a ton of storage space taking photos. I personally like the ability to save all of my original raw photos on the off chance that I want to go back to those sets maybe a couple years in the future to see how I can improve on them. So for that reason, I would recommend you guys get yourselves a few portable hard drives. The next accessory I'm going to recommend is a little bit weird. It is a color calibrator for your computer monitor or a color calibrated monitor in general. Now, color calibrated monitors can get extremely expensive, so I mention this suggestion to you with a lot of caution. With that being said, having a monitor that accurately displays your photos' colors to you is amazingly helpful. If you don't have something like this, you'll notice time and time again that you will edit a photo on your computer, send it to yourself on your phone, and the colors and the brightness look completely different. The better you can do to match the colors on your computer screen to the screens of the phones that are gonna be looking at your content, the easier of a time that you're gonna have editing. Again, these things can get pretty expensive, but as far as offering peace of mind goes, there's really not many other accessories that offer this much help. Before we conclude this section, I would like to talk a little bit about SD cards. Now, let's say you go to Best Buy, you see 4 SD cards, they all say that they're 128 gigabytes, but the one on the right is $100 and the one on the left is $25. What's up with that? To sum it up nice and easy for you, the difference between SD card prices essentially comes down to their read and write speeds. What read and write speeds are is essentially how fast your SD card is able to accept information from your camera, as well as how fast the SD card is capable of offloading that information onto your computer. So of course, having an SD card that reads and writes really fast is awesome for when you're pulling those photos off of your card onto your computer. However, they can also come in handy when you're taking rolling and panning shots. Reason being is that a lot of cameras shoot raw photos in high file sizes. So if you have an SD card that reads and writes slowly, you may go to take 5 or 6 photos in a row and the SD card will slow down, not allowing you to take photos anymore. Versus if you had an SD card with fast read and write speeds, you can essentially take as many photos as your camera will allow before it starts to overheat. Once you guys actually get to go out on your own and practice rolling and panning shots for yourself, you will understand how nice it is to have the ability to take as many photos as you possibly need to. With that being said, that's going to conclude section 3, understanding your gear. I hope you guys collected all of the information and absorbed it as best as possible. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump to section 4.